You married into this family. You didn't build it. Get out!
At 10, Doya, M. My father-in-law pushed my badge across the conference table and told security to take me out through the loading dock. His son Gavin laughed. My mother-in-law, Elaine, smiled. And my wife Camille stared at the polished wood. Ad unu, doi pa, M. That same man left a voicemail saying, Julian, please, just come back. In the 3 hours between those moments, I did not sabotage Whitmore Architectural Millworks. I did not call a client, freeze an account, or touch a company system. The contracts simply reacted to a decision the family had made without understanding what they had signed. And suddenly the man they called replaceable was the one person they needed in the room. That was the part they could not accept. For years, the Whitmores had treated my work like useful background noise important enough to rely on, never important enough to respect. The firing did not create my value, and the crisis did not prove I was secretly powerful. It only forced them to see the structure they had been standing on while laughing at the person who built it. I sat in my truck across from the fabrication plant and watched Preston call again. My hands were steady, but my jaw hurt from clenching it. Through the windshield, I could see the security gate I had redesigned after a theft problem 3 years earlier. Even the road they had used to remove me carried fingerprints of work they had stopped noticing. I met Camille Whitmore 8 years earlier at a neighborhood redevelopment forum in Charlotte. She was representing Whitmore Architectural Millworks, the family company her grandfather had started in a two-bay shop after coming home from the Navy. They built custom interiors for hotels, restaurants, private clubs, and historic buildings across the Southeast. I was there for a regional contractor who had hired me to untangle a hospital renovation that was 6 months behind schedule. Camille asked a sharp question about supplier lead times during a panel. I disagreed with her answer afterward. Instead of getting offended, she bought me coffee and made me defend my position for 40 minutes. I joined Whitmore Architectural Millworks a year after we married. Preston said the company needed an operations director who understood large commercial projects. Gavin, Camille's older brother, ran finance. Camille led business development. Elaine had no formal title, but somehow every hiring decision, client dinner, and family dispute passed through her first. The company looked stronger from the outside than it felt from the inside. Their work was beautiful, but every department operated like a separate kingdom. Purchasing ordered without checking schedules. Project managers promised dates production had never seen. Finance delayed vendor payments, then blamed suppliers when materials arrived late. My first year was not glamorous. I rebuilt the production calendar, renegotiated freight lanes, created a vendor scorecard, standardized change order approvals, and made project managers sit in the same room with estimators every Monday morning. Gavin called the meetings Julian's little factory church. Everyone laughed until our late delivery rate dropped by half. The joke inside the Whitmore family was that I had become the useful in-law. Elaine used that phrase at Thanksgiving once, and the table laughed. Camille squeezed my knee beneath the table and whispered that her mother did not mean anything by it. I smiled because that was easier than admitting the joke hurt precisely because everyone understood what it meant. Gavin's resentment was less subtle. He had grown up assuming the company would eventually be his to run. Every process I added felt to him like a lock on a door he believed should open because of his last name. He hated documented approvals, vendor comparisons, and any report that made a decision traceable after the fact. Our biggest opportunity arrived in the form of Aurelian House, a luxury hotel group preparing a 4-year renovation program across 11 properties. The total interior package was worth just under $96 million. Winning even the first phase would move Whitmore into a different class of contractor. Aurelian did not trust us at first. Their program director, Naomi Pierce, had inherited 2 failed millwork vendors on previous projects and had no interest in repeating the experience. She asked for 5 years of delivery data, supplier histories, contingency planning, staffing depth, and a named executive who would be personally accountable for every property. Preston wanted to put Gavin's name in the proposal because Gavin was family. Naomi rejected the idea during the second interview. She had watched him dodge 3 direct questions about cash reserves and schedule recovery. After the meeting, she asked if I would stay behind for 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes changed the company. Naomi told me Aurelian would continue the process only if I served as program executive and remained in that role through the first 3 hotels. She was explicit: my authority, reporting access, and continuity were part of Aurelian's risk approval, not a courtesy title. I repeated her language to Preston, Gavin, Camille, and the board council before anyone signed. The master services agreement named me as a designated key executive. Any removal, reassignment, or termination without Aurelian's written approval allowed the hotel group to suspend new work authorizations and mobilization payments until a replacement passed review. Our surety later adopted the same condition because its bonds were priced using Aurelian's approved management plan. Gavin complained that the clause gave one employee too much importance. I corrected him in front of the lawyers. I said it did not give me power, it gave the client protection. Preston signed the agreement anyway because the first 3 hotels represented $34 million and because he believed no family dispute would ever interfere with business. The bank saw the Aurelian contract differently. Whitmore's revolving credit line had been stretched thin by new machinery, overtime, and deposits on imported veneer. Once Aurelian signed, the lender increased our facility from $6 million to $11 million. But the amendment tied borrowing availability to active Aurelian work orders and valid performance bonds. That meant 3 separate pieces touched the same point: Aurelian's key person clause, the surety's management condition, and the bank's borrowing formula. I explained the chain at 2 board meetings and attached a 1-page diagram to a written risk memo. Preston acknowledged it. Camille initialed the board packet. Gavin replied with a thumbs-up emoji and called the warning theatrical. For almost a year, none of it mattered. We started the first Aurelian property in Charleston and finished the model floors 11 days early. The second property in Savannah moved into fabrication on schedule. Our backlog hit a company record. Preston accepted an industry award and thanked the Whitmore family tradition for the growth. The first real warning came from a plywood supplier in Tennessee. He called my personal phone and asked why 2 invoices had been moved to 90-day terms without notice. Our agreement required 45. I checked the accounts payable dashboard and found his invoices marked management hold with no explanation. 3 more vendors gave me the same answer that week. When I asked Gavin, he said he was preserving liquidity because Aurelian's payment cycle was slower than expected. That explanation might have worked if I had not spent 7 years watching cash move through the company. The timing was wrong, and the amounts were too selective. I asked for a detailed aging report. Gavin sent a summary instead. I asked again. He told me finance did not report to operations. Preston backed him and said I needed to stay in my lane. Camille later told me at home that I was making her brother feel like I was auditing him. I said that was exactly what basic controls were supposed to feel like. 2 weeks later, a freight dispatcher forwarded me a duplicate delivery request for a warehouse I did not recognize. The paperwork listed Granite Ridge Logistics as a project vendor. It was not on our approved list. Yet accounting showed more than $600,000 paid in 9 months. The registered owner, Trevor Hale, had been Gavin's college roommate. The address on the vendor file led to a small office park outside Gastonia. The suite number belonged to a mailbox service. The listed owner was a man named Trevor Hale. I knew the name because Trevor had been Gavin's college roommate and had spent the previous summer on Gavin's boat in Lake Norman. I did not accuse anyone. I pulled purchase orders, receiving records, freight logs, and change orders. The pattern got worse the more carefully I looked. Granite Ridge was billing Whitmore for rush logistics, storage, and procurement consulting. But most of the shipments were being handled by carriers we already paid directly. Some invoices referenced project numbers that did not exist. Others were approved on Sundays when the office was closed. A set of payments had been split into amounts just below the threshold that required a second executive signature. Every one of those approvals came through Gavin's credentials. and the pattern was too consistent to dismiss as sloppy bookkeeping. I took the evidence to Camille first. I wish I could say she looked shocked. What I saw was fear, followed almost immediately by calculation. She asked whether I had told anyone else, then lowered her voice, although we were alone in our kitchen. When I said I could document at least $600,000, her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Camille paced our kitchen for several minutes before telling me Gavin had been under pressure. He had made a bad real estate investment the year before. Preston had refused to bail him out again. She said Granite Ridge might be a temporary arrangement to move money until he could replace it. I asked her to listen to the sentence she had just said. She got angry. Not at Gavin. At me. She said families did not survive if every mistake became a prosecution. I said companies did not survive if family members treated the accounts like private checking. That was the first night in our marriage when Camille looked at me as if my refusal to protect her brother was a form of disloyalty. I told her I would give Gavin 48 hours to explain the transactions with documents. If he could, I would accept the explanation. If he could not, I would take the issue to the full board and our outside accountant. Camille said I was threatening her family. I said I was trying to keep her family from becoming a headline. The next morning, Gavin arrived at my office carrying coffee and acting amused. He closed the door and said Camille had told him I was playing detective. He claimed Granite Ridge was a legitimate logistics aggregator and that Trevor's involvement was irrelevant. I asked for contracts, delivery receipts, and proof of work. He said he would send them by end of day. Nothing arrived. Instead, my access to the detailed accounts payable module disappeared just after lunch. IT restored it after I filed a ticket, then removed it again an hour later on Gavin's instruction. That was when I stopped treating the issue as a family disagreement and started preserving records outside the normal reporting chain. I sent copies of the documents to Whitmore's outside counsel, not to accuse Gavin, but to create a timestamp. I also notified the audit committee chair, a retired banker named Denise Holloway who had joined the board after our credit expansion. Denise called me within 20 minutes and told me not to discuss the matter further until she reviewed it. That evening, Preston came to our house. He did not sit down. He stood in the living room with his coat still on and told me I had embarrassed Gavin by dragging an outside director into an internal accounting question. I asked whether he had reviewed the invoices. He said that was not the point. And the certainty in his voice told me he had already chosen the family story over the documents. According to Preston, the point was trust. He said I had been welcomed into a family business and had repaid that generosity by treating his son like a suspect. I reminded him that I had worked 70-hour weeks for 7 years, taken below-market compensation during 2 slow seasons, and personally rebuilt the systems that had made Aurelian possible. Elaine arrived 10 minutes later, which told me the conversation had never been meant to involve only Preston. She said I was confusing employment with ownership. You work for us, Julian, she said. Do not ever forget the direction of that relationship. Camille stood near the stairs and did not correct her. I looked at my wife and asked one question. If those invoices belonged to anyone other than Gavin, would she want them investigated? Camille stared past me toward the dark window over the sink. The refrigerator hummed in the silence. When she finally said, "This is different. He's family," I understood that I was no longer arguing about invoices. I was arguing with the rule our marriage would always lose to. I slept in the guest room that night. The next morning, Denise Holloway called and said the documents warranted a formal review. She had already asked outside counsel to preserve finance system logs. She also warned me that Preston was furious and that Gavin was lobbying directors to remove me before the review expanded. I asked whether they could remove me that easily. Denise said Preston did have delegated authority to terminate senior employees, but the bylaws required the audit committee to be notified when a termination involved someone who had submitted protected financial concerns. She sounded tired when she added that the family seemed convinced Aurelian would simply accept a substitute after the fact. That belief became their plan. Gavin began telling managers that I had become unstable under stress. Elaine called 2 longtime employees and asked whether I had been aggressive in meetings. Preston instructed HR to document every disagreement I had had with department heads over the previous 6 months. Camille stopped sleeping in our bedroom. She said she needed space until I decided whether being right mattered more than keeping the family together. I told her that sentence assumed protecting Gavin was the same as protecting the family. She said I always had to turn everything into a principle. I said principles were what mattered when exceptions became convenient. The Friday before the board meeting, Naomi Pierce from Aurelian called about a completely unrelated schedule question. Near the end, she asked whether everything was stable at Whitmore because she had heard rumors about leadership changes. I told her I was still in my role and would notify her if that changed. Exactly as the contract required. I did not warn her. I did not ask her to intervene. I did not tell her about Gavin. But after we hung up, I reread the key executive clause for the first time in months. Then I reread the surety endorsement and the bank amendment. The Whitmores could fire me. What they could not do was decide that everyone else had to pretend nothing changed. Monday morning, HR invited me to a leadership alignment meeting at 10. When I entered the main conference room, Preston sat at the head of the table with Elaine on his right, Gavin on his left, and Camille beside Gavin. No outside directors were present. A security supervisor waited near the glass doors. Preston began with a speech about culture. He said the company had grown because the Whitmore family knew how to stay united under pressure. He said my conduct over the previous weeks had become divisive and incompatible with the trust required of senior leadership. Gavin watched me with the relaxed expression of someone who believed the hard part was already over. I asked whether the board had completed its review of Granite Ridge. Preston said the review was no longer my concern. I asked whether Denise Holloway had been informed of the meeting. His jaw tightened. Elaine said I was proving their point by refusing to accept a simple personnel decision with dignity. Then Preston delivered the sentence he had clearly rehearsed. You married into this family. You did not build it. Gavin laughed. Elaine smiled. Camille stared at the table. Heat climbed into my face. But the room itself felt strangely cold. I looked at my wife until she met my eyes and asked whether she agreed. She whispered, "Please don't make this worse." HR pushed the severance packet toward me. It offered 8 weeks of salary in exchange for a broad release, a known disparagement clause, and immediate resignation from every company committee. I did not touch the pen. I asked whether the termination was without cause. Preston said it was a loss of confidence and that the distinction did not matter. It mattered. Aurelian's clause distinguished ordinary succession from termination without documented misconduct, reviewed by its risk team. I asked HR to state the reason in writing. Gavin laughed and said I could frame it. HR entered leadership incompatibility on the notice, a phrase that made clear this was not a safety event. Fraud finding, or performance removal approved by the client. I placed my badge on the table. Then I asked Preston whether compliance had been instructed to notify Aurelian, our surety carrier, and First Meridian Bank of the leadership change. He looked irritated and said routine notices would be handled after lunch. I told him they should handle them exactly as the contracts required. Elaine said I was trying to scare them on my way out. Gavin told security I was done. The supervisor walked me through the operations floor. Past people I had hired, trained, argued with, and defended. No one knew what to say. My assistant, Rosa, stood when she saw me carrying a cardboard box and then slowly sat back down. At the loading entrance, I turned around once. Through the interior windows, I could see Gavin standing inside my office with one hand on the back of my chair. He saw me looking and gave a little salute. That was the moment anger finally arrived. Not hot anger, something colder. The kind that makes details become very clear. I sat in my truck and called Denise Holloway. I told her I had been terminated for leadership incompatibility and sent the notice. She reminded me Preston had employment authority, but said he had bypassed the audit notification protection tied to my financial complaint. She asked whether I had touched any company system after the meeting. I said no, and she told me to keep it that way. My second call was to outside counsel because I wanted the preservation notice confirmed before Gavin had time to erase anything. My third was to no one. I turned my phone face down, drove to a diner 2 miles away, and ordered coffee I did not drink. I had spent 7 years solving Whitmore's emergencies. For once, I was going to let a contract do its own job. At 10, 47. HR submitted the required leadership change notice to Aurelian's vendor portal. Aurelian's system automatically routed it to Naomi Pierce and to the risk team because I was listed as designated program executive. At 11, Chasse. The risk team placed all new work authorizations on administrative hold pending review. At 11, 19. The surety company received the same notice through Whitmore's compliance feed. Because the active bonds referenced my continued oversight, the surety suspended issuance of the Savannah completion rider and requested a management change review. Without that rider, Whitmore could not release several major fabrication packages. At 11:42. First, Meridian's collateral monitoring team saw the Aurelian hold. The bank did not cancel the credit line. It did something more immediate. It excluded the affected Aurelian receivables from the borrowing base until the contract status was clarified. Whitmore lost nearly $3 million of same-day borrowing availability. None of those actions required me to lift a finger. They were the exact chain I had put in writing months earlier. At 2:03, payroll tried to draw on the line for Friday's wage funding and found nearly $3 million missing from expected availability. Production also lost authority to release 2 major material packages. That was when a contract diagram Gavin had mocked became the company's entire afternoon. My phone rang at 12:11. Preston. I watched it ring. At 2:15. Camille called. At 2:15. Elaine. At 2:21. Preston again. B12:35. I had 9 missed calls and 2 texts asking me to contact Naomi immediately and explain that the termination had been a misunderstanding. The same people who had given me 6 minutes to leave suddenly needed my answer before lunch ended. At 1:02. Exactly 3 hours after the meeting began. Preston left a voicemail. The confidence from the conference room was gone. He said the family had acted too quickly, that people had been emotional, and that the company needed me back before the Aurelian hold became permanent. His voice cracked once on the word needed, and I hated how much I noticed it. Then he said, "Julian, please, we can talk about the rest later. Just come back." I replayed the message once. The relief I expected never arrived. Hearing him beg did not repair the loading dock exit or Camille's silence. It only proved that fear could produce manners faster than respect ever had. And that was not the same thing as an apology. I called Denise instead. She had already spoken with Aurelian, the surety, and the bank. All 3 confirmed their holds were contract responses, not requests from me. She also said the outside reviewers had traced enough Granite Ridge payments to unsupported invoices that the audit committee could suspend Gavin's finance authority under its existing emergency powers before the full investigation was complete. That changed the decision in front of me. If I refused to return entirely, innocent employees could miss payroll, while Preston and Gavin blamed me for a chain they had triggered. If I rushed back without conditions, I would teach the family that public humiliation had no cost as long as they panicked soon enough. I needed a path that protected the workers without protecting the behavior. I told Denise I would attend an emergency full board meeting at 2:30, but I would not return as Preston's employee under the old structure. She said that was reasonable. I said my conditions would not be personal. They would be operational, written, and enforceable. She replied, "Good. Make them survive the room." The conference room was full this time. Denise sat with 2 outside directors, counsel, the controller, and a representative from the audit firm. Camille also held one of the family's board seats, something Preston had treated for years as ceremonial. Gavin had no laptop and no finance dashboard. Preston looked 10 years older than he had at 10 that morning. Preston started talking before I sat down. He said the termination had been a family decision made in a tense moment, and that everyone now agreed it should be rescinded. He said the fastest solution was for me to sign a reinstatement letter. Call Naomi and tell Aurelian that nothing meaningful had changed. I put the letter back on the table without reading past the first paragraph. I said something meaningful had changed. They had removed me for asking why money was leaving the company through a vendor tied to Gavin. 3 hours later, outside parties had shown them what their own contracts said. I was not going to help them erase either fact. Gavin leaned forward and accused me of engineering the whole situation by making myself irreplaceable in the Aurelian agreement. Naomi's risk representative, who had joined by video, cut him off. She said Aurelian had required the clause, not me, and that her company would have suspended work after any unapproved change to the named executive. The surety representative said the same thing. The bank's counsel added that the borrowing base adjustment was automatic under the credit amendment. One by one, the explanations removed the story Gavin wanted to tell. I had not pulled a lever. The Whitmores had simply discovered how much of their growth depended on obligations they had never bothered to respect. Then Denise asked me to state my conditions. First, Gavin had to be suspended from all financial authority pending the audit. Second, an independent restructuring officer had to control cash disbursements for 90 days. Third, every vendor more than 60 days past due had to receive a written payment schedule within 1 week. Fourth, the audit committee would receive direct access to finance system logs without family approval. Fifth, no Whitmore family member could terminate or discipline the program executive on Aurelian work without full board review. Sixth, I would return only as interim chief operating and restructuring officer, reporting to the full board, not to Preston. Preston stared at me after the last condition. Elaine said I was using a crisis to take control of a company that did not belong to me. I told her the conditions did not give me ownership. They gave the company controls it should have had before anyone wrote a 6-figure check to a mailbox tied to Gavin's friend. Camille finally spoke. She asked whether our marriage was one of my conditions. The question landed harder than I expected because part of me still wanted her to choose me in front of them. Even after everything, I said no. The company would not be used to bargain over our marriage. What happened between us deserved a room with no payroll, no contracts, and no parents deciding what loyalty meant. For the first time all day, Elaine had nothing to say. Denise called for a vote. The 2 outside directors approved every condition. Preston voted no. Camille, whose board seat now carried consequences instead of symbolism, abstained. Gavin was recused from audit matters because of the conflict. The resolution passed, and the room that had called accountability disloyalty finally made it binding. At 3, obtsprezeche. I called Naomi with Denise and counsel on the line. I did not ask for a favor. I told her the board had rescinded the termination, suspended the implicated finance executive, and installed independent cash oversight. I sent the written resolutions before we ended the call, and I made no promise that Aurelian had not already earned the right to walk away. Aurelian did not immediately restore everything, and I was relieved they did not. Their risk team scheduled a formal review for the next morning, requested the board resolutions, and interviewed the new cash control officer. The surety performed its own management check. If one phone call from me had erased the hold, the safeguards would have been theater. And theater was how Whitmore had reached this point. By the following afternoon, Aurelian released the administrative hold. The surety issued the Savannah rider. First, Meridian restored the excluded receivables after receiving the client confirmation. Payroll funded on time. No dramatic bell rang. People simply went back to work, which was exactly the outcome I cared about. The audit took 6 weeks. Granite Ridge had received just over $1.4 million across 18 months. Roughly $900,000 could not be tied to legitimate services. Investigators matched copied freight descriptions to invoices from real carriers and traced several payments into a property LLC Gavin controlled. The scheme was not one bad invoice. It was a system hiding inside our system. Gavin insisted the money represented repayment for private investments and consulting he had provided Trevor outside the company. The problem was that company purchase orders had funded those payments. Outside counsel referred the findings to the appropriate authorities and to Whitmore's insurer. Gavin resigned before the board could vote to remove him. Preston had not taken the money. but the audit showed he had overridden controls 4 times after Gavin complained that my approval rules were slowing operations. Each override removed a checkpoint later used to hide payments. When Preston called those decisions mistakes, Denise answered that mistakes become governance failures when the same warning is documented and ignored more than once. Elaine's involvement was harder to document. She had no finance access, but emails showed she had pressured the controller not to question Gavin in front of outside staff because family matters stay in the family. She had helped build the culture that made the scheme possible, even if she had not signed the invoices herself. Camille and I separated 2 weeks after the emergency board meeting. She told me she had spent her whole life learning that loyalty meant closing ranks before outsiders could see weakness. I told her loyalty without truth was only protection for whoever already had the most power. She asked whether I could forgive her. I said forgiveness and trust were different decisions, and my voice shook when I said it. The sentence hurt both of us. I loved her. That was what made it difficult. If I had stopped loving her, the choice would have been cleaner, but I could not forget the conference room. The way she had stared at the table while her father told me I had not built anything, or the way she had asked me to make the humiliation easier for them. We tried counseling for 3 months. Camille apologized without defending herself, which mattered. Then she admitted something harder. Before I found Granite Ridge, Gavin had told her he was borrowing against future distributions and promised to replace the money after Aurelian's next payment. She knew enough to be afraid, but chose not to ask questions that might force her to act. That confession answered the question I had carried since the kitchen. Camille had not simply frozen under pressure. She had chosen silence because silence protected the structure she was terrified to lose. I forgave her eventually, but I still filed for divorce. Love was real between us, so was the fact that I could no longer build a marriage around the hope that family pressure would be different next time. Preston stepped down as chief executive at the end of the quarter. He remained a minority shareholder and kept an office he used twice a week. But the board hired an outside CEO for the first time in company history. Denise became chair. Elaine stopped attending management meetings because there was no longer a family exception that gave her a seat. I stayed through the 90-day restructuring period, then accepted a permanent role only after the board separated operations authority from family ownership. My title became Chief Operating Officer, but the title mattered less than the reporting line. No one person could dismiss controls because a son, daughter, spouse, or cousin felt uncomfortable. We also changed how vendors were treated. Past due balances were paid down under formal schedules. Smaller suppliers received faster approval windows because they had carried Whitmore longer than any bank had. Rosa led the project to rebuild procurement controls, and I made sure her name appeared on the presentation when the board reviewed the results. A year after the firing, Aurelian awarded Whitmore the remaining properties in the renovation program. Naomi told me the decision had nothing to do with the drama. It had everything to do with how the company responded once the problem was exposed. Everyone has controls on paper, she said. We wanted to see whether yours survived family pressure. The company survived, but it was not the same company. That was the point. The lobby still carried a black and white photograph of Camille's grandfather in the original two-bay shop. Beneath it, the brass plaque had once read "Family Built." Denise replaced it with a line employees chose by vote, built by the people who do the work. I stood there a long time the first morning it went up. Gavin's case moved slowly through lawyers, insurers, and negotiations. I did not follow every filing. I had spent enough years allowing his choices to dictate my attention. What mattered to me was that Whitmore recovered most of the diverted funds through insurance, asset claims, and settlement, and no employee lost a paycheck because of his decisions. Camille left the company after our divorce was finalized. She said she needed to know who she was outside the family system she had spent her life protecting. We remained civil. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no holiday photos pretending nothing had happened, and no secret hope that one perfect conversation would restore the past. The morning of the second Aurelian Hotel opening, I walked the finished lobby before guests arrived. Walnut panels curved around the reception desk without a visible seam. Brass inlays caught the early light. Every piece had passed through hands that had nothing to do with the Whitmore last name. People whose skill had always been more important than the family mythology around it. A young installer named Mateo stood beside me checking a final joint with his fingertips. He had been an apprentice during the week I was fired. He asked whether the story was true that the company almost lost Aurelian because they sent me out a loading door. I told him the story had grown more dramatic in the retelling. I looked around the lobby at the installers, finishers, electricians, cleaners, and project managers getting ready for opening. I told Mateo I had not come back for the people who laughed. I came back because 100 people who never sat in that conference room should not lose their work to teach 4 relatives a lesson. The answer surprised him. A year earlier, it had surprised me too. That was the part Preston never understood when he first asked me to return. He thought I wanted leverage over the family. What I wanted was separation between consequence and collateral damage. Gavin needed consequences. Preston needed limits. Elaine needed distance from decisions. Camille and I needed honesty. Even if honesty ended us. The employees needed paychecks. Vendors needed to be paid. Aurelian needed a company that honored its word. Those were different needs. And anger becomes dangerous when it treats them as the same problem. Power is easy when all you want is to hurt the person who hurt you. It becomes harder when innocent people are standing close to them. 3 hours after my in-laws laughed while security walked me out. They begged me to come back because the company had discovered something the family refused to see. My value had never come from marriage. It came from years of work, trust, systems, and promises other people had learned they could rely on. Their panic did not create that value. It only put a clock on how fast they finally noticed it. And the strangest part was that the contract crisis did not make that true. It only made it visible. I had been the same man at 10 in the morning when Gavin laughed, at 1 in the afternoon when Preston begged, and at 3 when the board voted. Their understanding changed. My worth did not, and neither did the years of work they had tried to reduce to a marriage certificate. That is why I do not tell this story as a revenge story. Revenge would have been letting Whitmore collapse just to watch Preston understand me too late. What happened was harder and, in the end, more satisfying. I came back long enough to save the work, then helped build a company where no one person's last name could hide bad decisions again. If someone respects you only after discovering what they can lose by mistreating you, that is not respect. It is fear wearing better clothes. Real respect appears before the leverage, before the title, before the room learns your name matters. The lesson Whitmore finally learned was simple. Family can give you a seat, but only character determines what you do once someone without your last name sits beside you.